Good morning, everybody. My name is Toby Higbee. I'm the director of the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. And it's my pleasure to welcome our audience here in Bunch Hall on the UCLA campus and out there in the internet world. Folks from all across the North America are joining us, and we're very pleased to have you. So on behalf of, this is the Labor Studies Speaker Series. I'm very pleased to welcome you. And I'm just going to thank our various co-sponsors. And then I'm going to hand it off to Maga, who will introduce our speaker. So the Labor Studies Series is co-sponsored by the Labor Studies Interdepartmental Degree Program, the first and only Labor Studies major in the University of California system. It is co-sponsored by the Institute. Yes, you're allowed to clap. Our slogan is, or our motto is, social justice at work and in the community. And that's what we aim to do, to put ideas into action, to make the lives of working people better here in the United States and around the world. The series is co-sponsored by the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, by the Latin American Institute, the Center for Mexican Studies, and the Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies, and vicariously by the History Department, because I'm a professor of history and labor studies. And with that, I do want to personally welcome our speaker. I'm very excited to learn more about this work, about the global impact of the Mexican Revolution, a revolutionary moment that echoed across the 20th century and changed the entire world, but it doesn't have as much attention as some of the more famous European revolutions. But perhaps that's changing these days, and we'll learn more soon. So with that, I want to hand it off to our speaker series coordinator, Maga Miranda. She is a graduate student here at UCLA in the Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies. As she's a graduate student researcher with the Labor Studies Interdepartmental Degree Program and a visiting instructor at Pitzer College. Maga, come on up and introduce our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. So it's my pleasure. I just want to start off by echoing Professor Higbee's thanks to everyone who's joining us here, to all of our co-sponsors, and to the 30 plus people who are joining us all over the continent online. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest, Dr. Christina Heatherton. Christina Heatherton is a Elting Associate Professor of American Studies and Human Rights at Trinity College. For 2 decades, she's been working with social movements to produce collaborative works of political and popular education, including Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, published with Verso in 2016, and co-edited with Jordan T. Camp. She currently co-directs the Trinity Social Justice Initiative, and today we'll be talking about her recently published book, Arise, which I have a copy of. And we have possibly a code, so folks interested in purchasing the book through University of California Press can do so at a 40% discount, which I'll share in a bit. This year, this book, Arise, will be translated into Spanish and published in Mexico on La Cigarra Press. For folks who are joining us, who are familiar with book talks, traditional book talks, you might be a little bit surprised by the format today. When I was discussing the idea of this conversation with Christina, it was very obvious to both of us that we didn't want it to be a traditional book talk, just because there's such an upsurge in interest about social movement and labor organizing that I thought it would be an opportunity for us to sort of create a dialogue and bring you all into that dialogue. So I'm going to ask her a handful of questions today that we've sort of brainstormed over the last month or so. And I'm also going to invite Christina to ask questions back of me and the rest of the audience, if she so desires. And then around 11:15, we're going to try to transition the conversation into a proper Q&A session. If you do have questions during the talk, I encourage you to write them down and save them for the end. And folks who are joining us online through the webinar will also notice a Q&A box on your monitor. So please use the Q&A box freely, and around 11:15 we'll transition. So without further ado, I want to get into it. And I'm gonna go ahead and actually, Christina, did you have anything you wanted to add about?
Yes. Hi, good morning. Hello, good afternoon. I just want to express my deep and sincere and just unbelievably heartfelt appreciation for everybody who made this possible. This is such a dream to be here. And I particularly want to thank Maga, who I feel like I've understood the book better after being in conversation with Maga. I maybe just say briefly that I was also a student at the UC. My sister went to UCLA. I went to UC Berkeley. I've been on the other side of the country in Connecticut, but I've been watching the strikes of UC academic workers. And so, you know, I think I want to just start by saying I applaud your courage. I am deeply appreciative of all the ways in which particular contingents have pushed other issues to the fore, to think about these strikes as also issues of social reproduction, of questions of healthcare, of questions of racism and policing that I think are totally essential. You know, one thing I've learned in the course of doing this work is that every radical struggle is connected to a struggle for education. You know, sometimes those spaces are given, like the classroom we're in. Sometimes there's spaces that get carved out. Sometimes it's a combination of both. But in every place, the work is the same. We work collaboratively to understand the arrangements of power that are arrayed against us and confront the moment before us. So I take incredible courage from the students and academic workers that have struck, and it's an honor to be here. So thank you.
Yeah. That's a little bit of the context for what brings us here, but we'll get more into that. First, I want to talk about the title of your book, Christina, Arise. So for folks who are maybe not familiar with the word or the sort of meaning of it, Arise is a reference to the working class anthem, the Internationale, which Christina writes beautifully about in the concluding chapter. About its peak in this kind of internationalist history of the early 20th century, despite having been written by Eugene Potier in 1870s after the Paris Commune. Christina, you write that it was popularized by the International Working Men's Association, whose scope included not only labor issues, but abolition, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist struggles. I guess my question is, in broad strokes, can you talk to us about the arc of the book? What do you see happening in the early 20th century globally and internationally that contributes to this upsurge of radicalism, both in labor and social movements? And just to echo Toby's point, it was sort of an era of revolutions. And what is the relationship between these various efforts that you bring together in dialogue in Arise?
It's a small question to kick us off.
I know.
So I've been thinking about this question, like what happened in the early 20th century, and I think I actually want to start with what didn't happen, right? So revolutions broke out, but they didn't break out in the places that we assumed, right? Revolutions in the early 20th century didn't break out in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Chicago. They were not as predicted. Urban revolutions among the most organized segments of the working class in the Western world. That's right, in the Western world. Revolutions broke out in the so-called peripheries, the semi-peripheries, with people fighting colonial rule, dispossession, the loss of subsistence agriculture, routinized gendered violence, and the imposition of really barbaric social relations. And of course, the first major social revolution of the 20th century happened in Mexico. So the question is why? And I think I'll just say a few things about that. The first is that Mike Davis, across a number of his works, has really puzzled through this question of the revolutionary subject and revolutionary theory, right? And how do we grapple with this fact that the revolutions didn't unfold in the way that they were predicted, and we have this whole other history, particularly of the early 20th century, to deal with. I think the easiest way to answer it would be to just talk a little bit about how I come to the work. So a lot of my family came, on my mother's side, came from Okinawa to California through Mexico. One of my great uncles was a labor organizer in the Imperial Valley. He could speak Spanish, English, Japanese, and Okinawan dialects. So he was a very well-placed labor organizer, and actually suffered some state repression as a result. According to his son, he could take care of business because he had fought with Pancho Villa and them in the Mexican Revolution. So this was a kind of stunning anecdote that I was just, really interested in trying to trace. I couldn't find like an extended record of this relative, Masao Yamashiro, but I was able to find a memoir of a man named Paul Kochi, who traveled with my family. He knew a lot of my family, and allegedly we may be distantly related, but don't quote me on that. Paul Kochi wrote a memoir called Iman no Aiwa, an immigrant's sorrowful tale. And he talks about how in Mexico in 1917, he discovered internationalism. So my question was, why would someone coming from Okinawa, someone who was fighting against Japanese despotism, Japanese imperial rule, the extinguishing of Okinawan cultural forms and ways of life, what could have possibly accounted for this, possible solidarity between these two struggles? The story that I found of Paul Kochi was something that I resonated with other stories I began to find in the archive. So elsewhere in the book, I talk about M.N. Roy, who was an Indian, who was a fighter in the struggle against British colonialism in India. And he ends up also in Mexico in 1917. He describes it as the land of his rebirth. And he says it's also in Mexico, revolutionary Mexico, that he comes to find internationalism. So, I think just as a starting point of the book, I'm very interested in the ways in which countries like Mexico, like Japan and parts of Okinawa, like India, were pulled into the frenzy of finance capital in the late 19th century. So the conditions that happened in Mexico uniquely exploded into revolution, but were not unique to the country itself, right? Those relationships of dispossession, those relationships of the elimination of subsistence agriculture, the form of capitalist development that happened was a global phenomenon. And by opening up the archive, just by following this relative story, I found a kind of bewildering world routed through revolutionary Mexico, where this experience was not uncommon, where people who were supposedly not the revolutionary subjects of the 20th century were finding each other, were comparing experiences, were building solidarity, and were developing a form of internationalism from below that I thought was important to chart.
Fabulous. Thank you. That brings me to your second question, which is, I think, a question about your method and your way of approaching things as a historian. By many accounts, your interpretation of who the working class subject is, or the subject of global capital, is unorthodox or heterodox. You write, for example, that the international working class is, quote, never a singularity of any one party of political formation, but was a practice continually contested, arrived at, thought over, discovered, expanded. In other words, a process of continual becoming. That's on page 182. So you seem to be suggesting to me a few things with that. On the one hand, this approach de-emphasizes more fully formed political traditions or institutions, such as parties, unions, community organizations, to always think about the subject in formation. And then you're also speaking to this kind of way of doing history that suspends these formations temporally, thinking instead of subjects and institutions as information, not always the thing that they eventually become as told by future historians or other institutions. This methodological approach seems important given the ways that institutions, I think, tend to gatekeep memories or narratives about certain moments after the moment of the formation. So can you talk a little bit about this approach to history in general, and then maybe some ways that it manifests in the book?
Yeah, it's such a fantastic question, both about the kind of history itself and then the method for capturing it. I really appreciate that. I think that the question points to a pretty central tension in the fact of the unfolding, of the late 19th century, of the 20th century, of our own time, right? And the fact that categories are continually in motion, throughout the 19th century, even the category of revolution itself was continually being defined. So these are open, evolving categories. And the tension is with, as you say, the practice of naming, capturing, historicizing them, retelling them. And this is a really important tension to deal with. I think for people in this room, you're all aware that there's another feature of this tension is that when you come to study something, you are being asked essentially to stay in your lane. If you want to be legible to publishers, if you want to be legible to academic disciplines, if you want to be legible to the world in which this history circulates. And sometimes that means, for purposes of depth, we are encouraged to have sustained studies of singular sites. Sometimes those are geographic, they're regional, sometimes they're sectoral in terms of like what struggles we look at. Sometimes they are, ethnically or racially bound, or they're religiously bound. These are like for purposes of heuristics, how we're thought to examine things. And I think one of the cautions is that in doing so, sometimes we assign a certain kind of fixity or stability to categories that are precisely always in motion. So my kind of take home of this is that if capital is value in motion, anti-capitalist movements have to have a corollary movement in order to comprehend them. So in the book, I have a concept of convergence spaces. So these are socio-spatial sites. This is my key concept. I think I'd have it rolling off my tongue. So convergence spaces. These are socio-spatial sites within which different radical traditions are compressed and develop new articulations of struggle. So it's just a way of stilling the global movement of capital, of ideas, of credit, of countervailing circuits of revolution, and just thinking, how do we account for the unanticipated alliances, the ways in which people found common cause, the ways in which sometimes they didn't, but they fought, made new meaning. There's a kind of theoretical production that we don't always assign to social movements that I think Convergence Spaces helps develop. Maybe I'll just say one other thing really quickly, because you asked about the kind of prototypical working class subject of history. So I think it's really important to say that this is an iteration of Capital Volume 1, right? Thinking about the exploitation of surplus value through the wage, right? This was a part of Marx's analysis of capital, but in his full planned out schema, there were many studies that he was planning to do. He was planning to do a study on credit, another one on money, another one on land. In book 8 of volume Capital 1, he's thinking about slavery and colonialism. As Angela Zimmerman writes, in his writings with Engels during the Civil War, he's thinking about slavery, right? So there's not one singular place in which capital accumulation is located. And so our analysis of the anti-capitalist movements has to be equally capacious to think about all the different, intersecting, interlocking, but not necessarily simultaneous circuits of accumulation. And so, Convergence Spaces is my way of trying to do a lot, but trying to still all those things and show how they, new articulations of struggle are developed.
Yeah, no, I thought that was really fascinating. And then hearing you even reiterate that revolution itself, which is one of the central categories of your book and this research, is also something that's information. Like, what isn't? So I really appreciate that. And especially, I think I didn't mention this in our talk, but I think especially when we think about the 30s and 40s as like the era of the National Labor Relations Board, you know, these kind of like set in stone, highly institutionalized moments of like labor history. I didn't ask about that, and I'm not gonna put you on the spot, but also thinking about, I think that history is really important. I think that a good use of our time here today might be to highlight a few of the histories from the actual book, because the book is full of these like micro histories that are really, really fascinating. Including, you know, the first one's like how to make a rope, how to make a living. And so each one of them sort of traces a different period, space, but even those kind of, each chapter sort of jumps around and exactly how you've described. But these books, sorry, the histories in the book offer us examples of this convergence spaces, these convergences of forces. And I think I speak for many of us in the room when I say that I'm particularly interested in moments where these convergent spaces involved labor unions and strikes. As you know, many of us academic workers at UCLA and across the UC system recently participated in some of the largest strikes of higher ed workers in history. Just last quarter, 48,000 across the state, and will most likely do so again in a few years. Many other folks have also participated in UC AFT, AFSCME 3299 actions, and UTLA strikes, et cetera, et cetera. And although faculty are not formally unionized in the UC system, they've been some of our biggest champions and supporters. So with that context, I was most drawn when I was reading your book to those histories where you talk about convergences that contain elements of labor struggles. And one story that stands out to me is about the bridges that were built between unemployed workers. So maybe you can speak to that kind of concept of unemployed workers and striking agricultural workers across California during this period, and these kind of the way they tried to bridge major differences in a rural and urban divide. And then of course, there's also a kind of component of racial difference. And in your book, you spend a lot of time thinking about the question of the color line within and outside of organized labor. So if you can spend a little time sort of giving us just a little snippet of some of those where, and like I said, I'm especially interested in ones where you talk about labor.
Sure. So as Maga said, every chapter in the book is organized around how to make something. The introduction is how to make a rope. There's how to make a university, how to make love. And the chapter that you mentioned is how to make a living. And I just want to say briefly that this is a very intentional hat tip to the tradition of social history. You know, that's, I think, most famously encapsulated by the making of the English working class. But, you know, in my own personal trajectory, this is also routed through the history of radical Black studies, you know, particularly W.E. Du Bois and C.L.R. James, and a way of thinking always about how a thing is made, because if you can understand that a thing was made, it can be unmade. Power is not inevitable. It can be organized against, but understanding, you know, the components of how a thing came to be is essential to the struggle. So, you know, in organizing the book like this, I think I'm also inviting readers to think about this as an open process. You know, like, because this work we have to continue doing this, you know. So the chapter How to Make a Living, as Maga said, thinks about thinks across the capitalist landscape in Southern California. So I'll say really briefly that when we think about labor history in the 30s, oftentimes we think about 1934. This was a dramatic period of general strikes on docks and factories across the country. We don't always think about the year before, 1933, where in California, agricultural workers staged some of the most dramatic strikes. You know, I'm going to get the statistics wrong, but they are in the book. You know, over half of all fresh fruit in the country was being grown in California. You know, 70% of canned fruits and vegetables came from the state. And so when workers withdrew their labor in the San Joaquin Valley, in the Imperial Valley, in Yolo County, all over the state, this had a seismic effect on the regional economy and the global economy that it was connected to. I'm interested in these struggles, particularly because, as I mentioned, my own family came and was connected to radical struggles in the Imperial Valley among migrant agricultural workers. But at the same time, I think what the chapter uniquely does is it connects it to unemployed movements in the city, right? And thinks about the symbiotic circulation. Agricultural work is seasonal work, right? It's not year-long work. There are harvest seasons, right? Carlos Bulasan does a beautiful job of charting where workers went up and down the state, along in order to harvest different crops. But what happened in the off season? A lot of times workers, as Bulasan says, workers go to California and they usually end up in Los Angeles, right? And so in the off season, there's a really interesting story about what people did, what forms of mutual aid, what forms of survival people built and developed, especially during the Depression, right? When a third of the country is out of work, and when you're talking about Black and Latino communities, it's even more. The hunger, the suffering is dramatic. Sometimes I think we forget, because there were New Deal provisions that softened the blow, that offered relief, but those came about because people struggled for them. So what the chapter does is it thinks with some of the organizers about the connections between those two struggles. If the workers were connected across space, so was the struggle connected across space. Because what some of the organizers realized was that unemployed people in cities were being thrown off of welfare rolls, being sent into rural areas to break strikes, to scab, right? And so if you were going to help organize agricultural workers, you had to also be organizing unemployed workers in cities so that they weren't deployed against other workers, across this capitalist landscape. So I'm like getting all riled up about this chapter. I'm trying to remember what your question was.
Just about describing a convergence space, and I think you're doing that really well.
The one thing that I would add is that this chapter, as with the book, rests on like incredible research that other people have done, particularly about agricultural workers. So I need to mention Deborah Weber's oral history of agricultural workers in the San Joaquin Valley in this period, where she shows the decisive influence of the Mexican Revolution on these organizing strategies, right? People took that relationship and they brought it into strikes in the field. In my own research, I found this wonderful story. I kind of trace everything through the story of the organizer Dorothy Healy, who was a mentor to Mike Davis and was a stalwart in Southern California. I'd be happy to talk about her later. But she tells this really incredible story. So striking lettuce workers in the Imperial Valley came to Los Angeles. They said, we need help on this strike. She was a member of the Communist Party. The Communist Party had helped organize some of the other strikes. So she's all of 19 years old. She goes down there. She says, she's kind of cocksure. She stands in front of a group of workers, talks to them about the exploitation of their labor. And she writes in this oral history she did with Maurice Sherman that she notices that the workers are kind of like folding their arms and leaning back. And she says they're meeting her with this patient indulgence. And when she's done talking, they say to her, look, we've just been through a revolution, okay? We understand what's going on here. When you're ready, you just tell us where to be and we'll be there. So there are these really beautiful ways in which the Mexican Revolution itself was this galvanizing force within agricultural labor strikes in California in the 30s in ways that I think we still haven't grappled with.
It makes me think about, it's a little bit later, my grandfather was a bracero, but he was an avid Dodger fan, because when they weren't at work, they were like going to the city to watch a Dodger game, So fully Mexican, my family's fully Mexican, but I always say like my grandfather was a diehard Dodger fan. Thank you. Yeah, and for folks who haven't read the book, that section on that's related to the next question. About the influence of the Mexican Revolution on these formations that we think of as like, an LA-based formation. So in thinking about the book, I've been thinking again with the role of institutions and their relationship to kind of radical politics. When we were deciding on the title of this event, we threw out a few different possible options and decided on how to make a revolution, which I thought was a little cheeky to think about that an institution like UCLA would be the place to learn about how to make a revolution. But I think it speaks to this kind of a problem or concept about that you're describing of a lot of different institutions and their relationship to kind of more radical or revolutionary activity. So yeah, as I got into your book, I began to see the example that you're describing, which maybe you can talk a little bit more about with the AFL specifically. Okay, sorry. As I got more into your book, I thought that it offered a lot of lessons for thinking about the ways that institutions do or don't relate to kind of more revolutionary politics. Like you're describing, the example that you're describing is of these workers who have lived through revolution, and at the same time, right, the AFL at the time is saying that they're unskilled workers who don't deserve to be unionized, when they have this kind of consciousness that is actually really revolutionary. So it's really interesting to think about the AFL's refusal to organize the workers that they considered unskilled, but then the ways that workers also were bringing their radical traditions to bear on organizing. In this example, I guess I just want to think with you about what that history is, and then what it might tell us about just the role of it. And now that you're bringing it up, I've done a lot of work with like domestic workers, and it's the same thing, right? Like when you go and you're organizing them. This was my undergrad paper was about their organizing strategies, and I'd go up to them and be like, "Hi, can I, what do you need? How can we help you?" And then they'd be like, "Girl, like I fought in the Central American Revolution, and I'm a member of the CPUSA, and whatever." And there'd be I always tell a story about this woman who I was living in Oakland at the time, and it was during early Black Lives Matter movement, and there was a lot of kind of conversations about respectability politics because it was like a nonprofit. And one of the women just kind of stood up and was like, "I was on the freeway last night, occupying the freeway," and just that kind of like interesting discrepancy, I think, is something that, even though it's a history book, has a lot of resonances today.
Yeah, totally. On this last point, I think Peter Kwan in his book Chinatown makes this very important point that I've also found relevant in every struggle happening in the United States today, which is that sometimes when we think about labor history, like the clock starts as soon as a person comes into the country, right? And we often disavow what are the revolutionary traditions that people have coming into the country? What are they bringing into struggles? What are the ways that we can begin to imagine with people, like what are their frameworks? What are their categories? How are they talking to other people? How are they making new meaning? So I think I'm really glad you brought that up. This is such an interesting history to think about in Los Angeles, because there was a concerted effort in the late 19th and particularly in the early 20th century for Los Angeles to buck what they called the red trend on the West Coast. We have such radical cities in the West Coast, San Francisco, Seattle, they're highly organized cities. And so a cabal of different regional capitalist interests came together to make Los Angeles, they called it the white spot. I think it's the white spot, it's in the book, of the West Coast. This was going to be a place that broke organized labor. This was going to be a place where the type of militancy that was happening in other places was just not going to fly, which makes it such an interesting place to think about what unfolded. So part of the reason the Communist Party made inroads in Los Angeles was precisely because, and let me say that sentence again, part of the reason the Communist Party made inroads in Los Angeles in really unusual sites of organizing was because they were kicked out They were excluded from other sites of organizing. So as you mentioned, the AFL, notoriously nativist and racist in this period, you know, like had policies excluding Black, Asian, Mexican, indigenous workers. And so, you know, radical formations, including the Communist Party, couldn't get into factories at the time. They weren't making any inroads. And so what happened? Where did they go? In the Depression, it was not by design. It was not by design that they started doing organizing among tenants, among the hungry, among single women, among migrant workers. These places were relatively off the map in terms of organized labor, but these are the places that organizers were forced to go. So some of the most beautiful stories, my grandfather grew up in Boyle Heights, take place in Boyle Heights. Hey, hey. In places like Boyle Heights, where the city comes to be, right? Who's there as a result of the racism and segregation in the city? Well, this is where the world is, you know, this is where my Japanese grandfather said he learned how to swear in 7 different languages before he was 9 years old, because that's Boyle Heights, right?
I just want to give a shout out to Carolyn Luce, who does a lot of work on Jewish Boyle Heights as well.
I saw a head nod. I saw a head nod. So, you know, I mean, what's incredible about the type of organizing that comes into being is that it was, you know, I mean, in some ways, the project is very much, or this chapter is very much in dialogue with Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe, who's someone I worked with on the dissertation, because, you know, the organizing comes out because of need, not because someone had a theory or a formula initially that said, this is how the working class is constituted. Here's the, you know, breakdown of the profile of the revolutionary class subject. It's like people are getting kicked out of their homes, right? People are getting kicked out of their homes in the Depression. Dorothy Healy reflects back, you know, she's like in her 80s or 90s by the time she does this oral history, and she says the most powerful, transformative organizing she saw was in organizing the unemployed councils in Los Angeles, particularly women who organized their neighbors, women who organized the tenants around them, who were facing hunger and displacement. And, you know, the really powerful thing about doing this research was how much organizers I was in dialogue with around the country were drawing on the same history. So, you know, I would think about Randy Storch's Red Chicago, where he's talking about the unemployed councils there and the tactics they used to fight displacement and eviction, right? When someone was evicted, they would just organize people to take all the furniture, bring it back into the house. And organizers in Chicago were doing the same thing, you know, in the early 2000s to fight very similar conditions. So this is a live history. These questions, like you said, you know, these are live. How do we not just move from, you know, as I say at the end, like there's no royal road through theory. There's, you know, we can be influenced by it. But if we don't understand this as a constantly evolving process, we don't have our ear to the ground of the struggles as they're evolving, you know, what are we doing?
Fabulous answer. And I guess this is going to be my last question to you, but it's related to everything. Something that came up during our recent strike had to do with this idea, something that I'm still thinking about, and I think other people here are still thinking about, is this idea of how to link struggles over labor or the strike to social movements. Here was COLA for All and tenant organizing, BLM and Cops Off Campus, disability justice groups, feminist and social reproduction strikes around childcare and dependent care. So although our strike was officially over an unfair labor practice, these kind of questions kept coming up. Your approach and your kind of method, or your idea of convergence, the tool, the theoretical and conceptual and methodological tools that you offer, I think, seem adept to thinking through some of this, what we might call the relationship between quote unquote non-economic issues and these bread and butter issues. And I guess my question is, you know, to the best of your knowledge or this archival research, what were people theorizing about these questions? I mean, I guess that you're saying that there wasn't as much of a, that it was like practice based, but even that, right, is sort of presenting us with a kind of even if it's a theory in formation or multiple theories in formation. I guess it's the question that I'm still sort of thinking through, having just come out of this kind of period of like, how do we articulate this? And given that the 20s and 30s, as you're describing, is this period where these kind of eruptions are happening? I wonder sort of if you can talk about that at all or have any insight.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
I think one chapter where I think some of those connections that you're drawing come together is in a chapter called How to Make a University, right? So this is a chapter about Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in World War I, which the Department of Justice called the University of Radicalism. There was a problem of people being arrested and leaving as organizers. It was such a routine problem that a young J. Edgar Hoover personally monitored the mail of Ben Fletcher, who was one of the most talented organizers of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. He was a Black organizer, and he personally mentored like a whole generation of other Black organizers. But he was doing this in prison, so people would come in. Leavenworth was a military prison initially, so there's a lot of soldiers incarcerated for things like mutiny, and then they leave and they become organizers. So I initially was interested in Leavenworth because I knew that this was where Ricardo Flores Magón died. And I mean, this is such a puzzle, I think, for people in this country to think about. Ricardo Flores Magón, one of the greatest agitators of the organizers, visionaries of the Mexican Revolution, dies in Kansas in a prison cell, right? So I had initially gone to think about him, about his comrade Librado Rivera, his brother Enrique Flores Magón, who were all in this prison. What I found was that a number of laws that had been passed during World War I, including the Espionage and Sedition Act, meant that political dissent was a federal crime. So radicals of all stripes, whether they were anarchists, pacifists, socialists, Bulgarian communists, Indian nationalists, members of the Indian Gadar movement, pacifist Mennonites, they were all in the same prison at the same time. And this Department of Justice idea that it was a University of Radicalism was not, wasn't a metaphor. They actually built a university in the prison. And going through the records of the National Archive, you see people ordering textbooks and notebooks, people talking about the lectures that they were going to, people's lectures notes. And so there's this incredible convergence of all these revolutionary traditions that were happening in this prison. The prisoners developed their own newspaper. It was called the Leavenworth New Era. And in it, Enrique Flores Magón actually had a column called the Mexican Kaleidoscope, where he educates his fellow prisoners about the history of the Mexican Revolution through all these serialized short stories. So there's this really dramatic way where you see people are consciously learning from each other. They're talking with each other. This is both in the formal university and also Ricardo Flores Magón worked for a while in the prison library. There's records of people coming and talking with him. There are records of wobblies, going outside in what they called Wall Street, which was just a pathway through the outside of the prison, talking with each other. What did revolution mean? What did these struggles mean? I was able to go to Enrique Flores Magón's great grandson has just opened an archive of his relatives' papers in Mexico City, and in there I got to see his library, what books he was reading while he was in Leavenworth. And there's this one extraordinary thing. I reproduce a picture of it in the middle of the book, where Louise Bryant, who was a socialist feminist in the U.S. How many of you seen the movie Reds? Okay, at least a few. All right, so this is she was a socialist feminist. She went to Russia. She speaks with a lot of Bolshevik feminists there. So you open this book, it's got Enrique Flores Magón's prison number. And then the next page, he has this note that says, "To my fellow prisoners, please do not write in this book and return it to the owner as soon as possible, because there's a number of people waiting to read it, right? And so take good care of it." And you're like, why were all these prisoners reading about the socialist feminists, in the Russian Revolution? So, the questions that you ask about where are the sites of struggle, I think is really key to the whole project. I did this book at the same time that I was working with a number of housing organizers, that there's name of that, organizers that are fighting homelessness, organizers that are fighting against policing, against mass incarceration, against militarism, and against all their convergences. So, there was a constant way. I mean, this is why this is really moving for me to be in Los Angeles. This is the first talk I've given on this book in Los Angeles, but this book comes about here. This book comes about because the convergent spaces that I'm trying to describe here are things I understood in motion. People who are fighting eviction, people who are fighting the cops, people who are fighting mass incarceration in this city are doing all the things that organizers in the book are doing. I wouldn't have had the eyes to see it if it weren't for people, organizing in Skid Row with the Los Angeles Community Action Network. So I don't know if I answered any of your question, but I just mentioned a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question was also about how knowledge is produced and circulated. And I really appreciate you talking about the kind of popular education of it all too, right? Like just dialoguing, but also like storytelling and disseminating the information in different forms of media too, is super, super interesting. That was my last question, but I also remembered because we actually connected around the book because I got an early copy and your publisher asked me to write a book review and I didn't get to it, but I did start it. And I want to read how I was planning to start it, which is from a letter dated February 1918 from Emiliano Zapata to his general Amezcua, who was in Cuba as an ambassador at the time. And it says, Mr. Wilson, President of the United States, was right when he recently paid homage to the Russian Revolution, describing it as a noble effort to attain liberties. It would be good, however, if he would remember this statement and bear in mind the clear analogy, the striking parallel, and rather the absolute equivalence between that movement and Mexico's agrarian revolution. And then he continues identifying the commonalities between the Russian and the Mexican Revolution as unity against the common phenomena of privatization perpetuated by property owners. He says both are directed against what Leo Tolstoy called the great crime, the infamous usurpation of the land, for the land which, like the water and air, belongs to everyone, who has been monopolized by a few property owners supported by powerful armies and iniquitous laws. So I thought that was super interesting, right? Like your book is really putting together, because I think this is always, like you're saying, right, always been there in tidbits, but really putting together the real influence of the kind of Mexican Revolution that Emiliano Zapata was advocating for in 1918, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe as a final.
Yeah, final remark. Yes, please.
I think I'll just say something again about M.N. Roy, who, it's such an interesting story of this man. So he goes from being this ardent Indian nationalist. He grows up under ferocious British colonial rule, devotes his life to the struggle of overthrowing it, seeks arms and support all over the world, is exposed to all different kinds of struggle, but ends up in Mexico. And he actually becomes one of the co-founders of the Mexican Communist Party. This is not uncommon that people who are the heads of Communist Party come from other places in the world. I mean, there's a whole kind of, the history of the left is a history of convergences that we don't, always know how to trace. A lot of times M.N. Roy is remembered best for a debate he had with Lenin in the Comintern over the national and colonial question, right? And so, the terms of that debate were that countries under colonial or imperial rule had to collaborate with the petty bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeois classes in order to organize revolution. And Roy says, this is absurd. Like, why, if the struggle is for the working class everywhere in the world, why when you come to India, why when you come to other countries, do you not have the same faith in what we understand as a working class, but you think that we're not of sufficient age, development, maturity, to achieve revolutionary aims? And what's so interesting is that these writings, if you look at the writings he was doing in Mexico, he's developing these theories there before he brings it to the Comintern. So a lot in the second chapter, I'm really trying to think through how organizers in their own time were confronting some of the conceits of the color line, the conceits of racism within the left, the conceits of underdevelopment, this idea that until a country went through capitalism, it could not become revolutionary. And so, you know, thinking with all these figures who were developing their own radical theory, developing their own convergences and syntheses of struggle, I think it really challenges a lot of the ways that we think about colonialism, about racism, about capitalism today, in ways that I think, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. I'm not saying that all the answers were developed 100 years ago, but there's a lot that could help us. There's a lot that we can stand on in our current struggles. And so much comes into view when we think about left history, you know, not, Fadi Badawill has a wonderful essay called Moving Past Models, where he says, you know, sometimes we think about, I guess to go back to Toby's original point, we think about revolutions as like the European bourgeois revolution. These are the exemplar, right? And then everything else is measured against it and usually comes short, right? Is usually seen as belated or derivative, you know, a bad copy. But if we rethink revolutions, how they developed, how they engineered their own kind of theories, if we have another way in, something that thinks about Mexico. I mean, think about this, right? How does left history change if you think about 1848, not in France, but in Mexico? How does that change the way you think about the evolution of the global capitalist system and the evolution of revolution? Evolution. So that's, yeah, I'll offer that as a
Full circle. Yeah. Fascinating. And that was it for my questions, but I wanted to open it up to see if you had any, I guess you final thoughts or questions that this kind of conversations also raise for you. And they could be rhetorical questions, you know, or it could be like pointed questions for individuals here or 40 people on Zoom.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is such an incredible group of people that are in this room. I don't know the people on Zoom, but I'm sure you're incredible too. So, you know, the one thing that I'm really interested in when other groups of people who have organized have picked up the book, the things that they find interesting, compelling, that they want to wrestle with is the question of education within struggle. So one of the things that I'm really interested in this room at this moment is to think about how and if people think about education differently after coming out of the organizing in the fall. You know, this is hard work to do. This is extremely hard work to do. It's kind of a miracle. No, it's a full-blown miracle that this book exists. You know, like these institutions, they were not built for us. They were not built to protect us. They, you know, I've said before that, you know, writing a book is like holding a fistful of seeds through a forest fire. And if you make it through, you know, you plant whatever's left, but it's like, it's an extraordinary process of will. So, you know, this is a really just unique opportunity to think with a lot of people who've been through struggle. Like, you know, the strike was hard, the conditions are hard, but if you're here, it means you didn't leave it. So how are you thinking differently about education as a, you know, after going through all that? I think that's the question I'd be interested in.
We have 5 questions from the audience too in the chat. Does anyone want to give an answer? Yeah.
I know. So I really appreciate your talk so much because I'm working through this with my own book project, which as Maga mentioned is about Jewish radicals in early 20th century LA. And you know, I kind of want to open space for you to talk a little bit more about what you mean by convergence spaces, because even as you're saying it's not institutional, you've referenced the Communist Party multiple times. The Unemployed Councils was a Communist Party project. You also referenced the IWW, that of course is an organization, an institution, even though it's sort of fibrous and decentralized. And you know, when you, having read Dorothy Healy's autobiography and all of her oral histories, this woman is dogmatically a communist, even as she's saying this is not about party principle, this is just about organizing, even as she's dismissing, you know, there's that scene where she gets sent to the conference in New York and the guy Max is trying to discipline the way she presents these stupid communists. And yet she's in Imperial Valley because she's sent there by Sam Darcy. She's, you know, participating in these actions because she's being dispatched to this institution. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what you mean by convergence spaces. Also anticipating that, you know, we have the wonderful gay Teresa Johnson's notion of kind of spaces of solidarity. You know, Daniel Marshall Struthers has talked about the discursive spaces within these movements. So can you sort of explain a little bit more what you mean by that? I haven't had a chance to read the book. I cannot wait. And we certainly need to talk more, but just can you sort of flesh that idea out for us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. And you're absolutely right to say that there are like institutional histories, there are political formations, you know, within the book. I think what's surprising to a lot of people, you know, coming to it, assuming, you know, like they know that Dorothy Healy's in the book, and then they're like, what are all these anarchists doing in here? What are these members of IWW? You know, what are these fellow travelers? So it's not, I mean, I think the best review I got so far, as I said, is principally non-sectarian, and that's deliberate. Let me answer the question this way, and then I'll try to give you a more refined definition of what I mean by convergent space. I was really deliberate in taking the title, the first word of the Internationale for the title of the book, Arise. I think there's a really interesting history of people doing this. Melvin Dubofsky, in his book around the history of the IWW, you know, just calls it We Shall Be All. You know, Frantz Fanon, I think famously takes the second line of the song for Wretched of the Earth, Arise, you wretched of the earth. And is Dorothy Healy, you know, when she speaks to Maurice Sherman, she actually says that what she wants to call her own memory is traditions, chains have bound us. So it's a slight adaptation of the lyric. Instead of no more traditions, chains have bound us, it's traditions, chains have bound us, right? And this is what she said upon leaving the Communist Party. And her insight, you know, that she reflects on with him is she says, when a radical tradition stops its, you know, ruthless critique, when it's no longer questioning, then it's dead. When it turns into dogmatism, it's dead. So the challenge is to keep alive the questioning nature, is to keep alive the critical spirit, so that you're always doing like a new assessment, you know, a new read of the conditions, or else it's not radical. So my sense is that, you know, everybody who's like plumbed the lyrics of this song has been grappling with the challenge of internationalism and solidarity in their own day. So, I mean, part of the way the book is constructed is to think about those challenges at present. And I did not want to just give a sectarian history. I mean, there's very interesting, I mean, I've drawn from, I've benefited from, but I thought it was important to be able to say that even these political formations were in formation in this period. People moved through them, you know. I mean, I tell the story of Alexandra Kollontai. It was a very interesting path through the Communist Party, you know, in the way that she develops her own conceptions of radical socialist feminism. But, you know, she's in dialogue with, you know, organized women, like throughout, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. That probably means wrap it up.
My car alarm.
I hope everything's okay.
Sorry.
So, you know, convergence spaces is just, I think it can be somewhat unwieldy to tell people like, you know, look, here's the movement of capital. Here's the movement of, you know, here's these circuits of accumulation. Here's how we think about credit. Here's how we think about displacement. Here's how we think about imperial rule and extractive economies. So that if you're trying to think about the struggle of auto workers, say in Detroit, but you're not thinking about struggles over the extraction of rubber in South America, are you really talking about the same struggle, right? So we need to have a capacious enough imagination to think about how capital moves and how struggles against them have also moved. So, unavoidably, you're talking about left history, there is going to be like elements of the organized left in it. But I was deliberate in being able to trace people as they moved in and out, as sometimes the infrastructure was produced by the left, but it wasn't always determined. So the story of the Communist Party, yes, they definitely, Sam Darcy said, you go to the Imperial Valley. But as I understand it, from Mark Wild's street meeting among, other people who have written about the party in Los Angeles, the formation of those struggles did not simply come about through dictates, right? People in Moscow didn't know everything that was happening on the ground in Los Angeles, and there were many surprises and contradictions in terms of who was organizable and why, and what struggles they drew together. That's the part I'm interested in. That's what I'm trying to highlight with Convergence Spaces.
We have 8 questions on the Q&A, so I'm going to ask you one that I thought was excellent. Someone said, if I heard well in the presentation, Arise is being translated to Spanish by La Cigarra. Excelente. It's really necessary that a global and bottom-up view like yours be in dialogue with the Mexican Academy. Congratulations, Christina. In that sense, what do you think are the main challenges for translating your book into Spanish? And I would also add opportunities. And this is Diego Bautista with the Instituto in Mexico City.
Oh, well, first, I'm like delighted. This is, I think, the first connection we've had. We follow each other on social media. And, this person
is Convergence.
Yes, this is the Convergence right here. So I think social history is, this is, Diego is a great practitioner of social history. So this is, so when you announce that, that's the first time that's been publicly announced. This is just settled, and the book is going to be published in Mexico in Spanish, and I'm totally thrilled. Ask me in a few months when I'm in the translation process about like what the challenges are. I've never had a work translated. The La Cigarra Press, I think, does beautiful books and has I think the thing that put me at ease was I have a sense that they are interested in politics and poetry. Mm-hmm. So I think the challenge is I try to elevate the poetry of these movements. I've worked with Robin Kelly, I've worked with Ruth Gilmore, I worked with Maria Elena Martinez, I worked with Laura Polito, and I think from all of them, I really learned that if you practice the art of listening, you come to find the poetry. You do, like Marcus Rediker said, you listen to the archive until it starts speaking to you. So, my investment in a translation is just preserving that poetry, which I'm confident that they'll do.
Thank you. And related to that, we have someone, Ricardo Ramirez, who didn't submit a question, but said, by the way, I'm listening from Beijing, China.
Hey, all right.
International. I like this comment that I want to read to. It's from Elizabeth Koch. And it's a response to your question. They said, thank you for organizing this great discussion. Unfortunately, I can't stay through the Q&A, but I resonate very much with your question about education because I see the lack of labor education on campus, or rather the lack of access to the spaces that potentially exist. I'm not in labor studies. It seems to me the strike really helped to get people together to find that this is, as well as other kinds of labor organizing, is possible and in many cases already underway. So thank you. Are there questions from people here? I think it'd be good to kind of alternate.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So I guess for the next generation of organizers, which institutions or agencies have you identified that will be directly at odds at building social movements or radical organizing? What specific institutions and agencies?
Ooh, on the spot. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll give you a little menu after, but I think one thing that I've been really interested in, during Camp and we worked on several edited volumes about the relationship between policing and displacement and, gentrification in Los Angeles before we put Policing the Planet together. And this was like right after the explosions happened in Ferguson, Missouri, in Baltimore, like in 2015. The book came out in 2016. And one thing an organizer told me that I was really interested in is he said, you know, I mean, for those of you, I find I have to explain this because I don't know who's in the room. So, you know, Black Lives Matter, one of the first like major explosions, what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, after the police murder of Mike Brown. So this organizer said to me something really interesting. He said, I wasn't surprised that it popped off in Ferguson. You know, we might be surprised that it didn't pop off in Los Angeles or Chicago or New York. And the difference was the presence of nonprofits, right? The difference was that there weren't structures in place to mediate people's rage, right? As Dejane knows, and I'm sure other people here know, like, you know, the conditions that led to that explosion were certainly not unique to Ferguson, were not unique to Missouri. They were widely felt, but the shape that those protests took, I think really varied. And it's something I've thought about a lot in a lot of other contexts, right? It's a very, I mean, you know, there's any number of critiques about the nonprofit industrial complex. The revolution will not be funded. But this is, you know, the mediation is very tricky, right? I mean, sometimes it gives infrastructure, but also it does have this function of mollifying rage, turning it into something else, you know, like helping funnel things towards a kind of pragmatism, when sometimes the question isn't what's possible to be voted on by the city council, but what actually needs to be fundamentally transformed. So I think that it's, you know, I mean, this is such an ambitious title you've given this. I'm obviously can't talk about the past, present, future labor struggle, but I will say that every social movement that has in its heart a sense of what the problem is, where it is, what requires transformation, regardless of whether it can be pragmatically addressed at this moment, like that's the anchor you have to hold. So that's, I think that's my way of answering your question without naming names, but you know, I'd be happy to hear what you thought after the talk. Thank you for the question.
We can take another question from the live audience.
I have another one. I want to see if you would
Right.
Well, Toby's giving me the look.
No, I can give, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just waiting to see if anybody else.
Is that okay, Carol?
No, please.
So I really enjoyed the talk, and the concept of convergence spaces is really resonant, you know, with the way movements come together. And of course, I think as Caroline is suggesting, it's complicated because there's institutions involved, and your question about the university as an institution, a perhaps mediating or mollifying institution is certainly spot on. So my question is about conflict within the convergence, as it were, about in these movement spaces. You know, one of the things I learned through studying the 20s and 30s was that you know, people who are in these movements and then there are these splits and they fight with each other. So it doesn't mean they're not in a relationship anymore. When you split, you're still in a relationship. It's just that you're in a conflicted relationship. So and there's sort of, so I guess what my question is, to wrap it up, what role do you see, or is there a role within these movements for people who were consciously forging and supporting relationships, you know, the human relationships within the movements? You could maybe call them movement caretakers or curators, or however you want to, you know, think about it, as opposed to the traditional kind of positionality of the militant, who is, their job is to heighten conflicts. So that, I guess that's what I'm curious, what you reflect on that from your studies of these internationalists who were certainly had plenty of opinions that were perfectly
Yeah, the left, the fractious history, don't say. I definitely don't want to give the wrong impression that the book is just about, that it's sunny or romantic. A lot of the book is about defeat. I mean, where does the International come from? The defeat of the Paris Commune. Eugene Poitier saw his friends slaughtered in the counter-revolution that crushed the Paris Commune. So much of the left is about fractures, is about friction. And a lot of the book doesn't try to gloss over that. I would say that, there are different ways that the book thinks about the production of those frictions. And there's a longer argument that I don't have confidence in myself to give a short gloss on about the subjectivities of the new imperialism, how people were charmed. I show in some chapters how the same conditions that produced a revolutionary consciousness also produced quite conservative consciousness. Not everybody went to Mexico and said, oh, I'm going to join the revolution, or I see, my own fate tied up with the people of the world. A lot of people, especially in the United States, went to Mexico to make an easy buck, to try to capitalize on things there. But your question was about infrastructures of care. There's a chapter in the book called How to Make Love, and it thinks really deeply with Alexandra Kollontai and her relationship with Mexican feminists and, feminists around the world who were trying to articulate, early formulations of social reproduction, but particularly her concept was comrade love, right? How do we think against the property categories that organize our social relations, and also, as you say, can contain our struggles. And so, I think there's some very interesting work that she does to try to think about that revolutionary struggle from the position of care. So, she's one of the first women who ever served in a political cabinet position, and she was a commissar of social welfare in the Soviet Union. And a lot of what her physical work was trying to figure out, if you don't organize society in order to reproduce the nuclear family, if you think about everybody who gets left out of that, if you think about single people, if you think about elderly people with nobody to care for them, you think about disabled people, if you think about orphans, right? Like, instead of them being some kind of unsightly excess on the outside of society, what happens if they're the center? How does that change the way you think about the state and institutions of the state? And so, so love for her becomes this ballast of her, the way that she organizes her own social relationships. But I think there's some very interesting ways that she's thinking about revolution and politics in general. That's unfortunately a tragic chapter, but I think the resonance of how feminists in this period were thinking very seriously about this question is something I'm really interested in.
Very Valentine's Day.
Oh yeah, love, right.
Totally forgot. I was like, Valentine's. Comrade love.
Comrade love.
You be my comrade. That was a great question. It's almost like we set that up for Valentine's Day. There are a few other questions, but I'll maybe take one or two more here. I think one of them sort of fits well with that. There's someone who's interested in your discussion about the education in the universities, the prison universities, and then the way that the universities spread knowledge of radicalism and socialist feminism. They're really interested in the question. They said, how can we continue to not undermine the potential of political prisoners from Mexico to Latin America and the US, and their making of these spaces and creating and spreading knowledge? How can we see feminists rising in today's spaces of imprisonment and incarceration? And that's Galo Lopez.
Well, I do just want to do a time check too, because
the Q&A was supposed to start at 11:15, so we're good.
We were wrapping up.
No, we're good.
Okay, so can you repeat the question?
Yeah, they were interested in, I guess, contemporary examples of kind of education and feminist knowledge production in prisons or spaces of incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the movement against mass incarceration, the movement for abolition is, being like driven by feminists and queer and trans activists right now. So, I mean, I don't even know how to isolate, like, here's a person. I just think that some of these questions about, how we understand power, how we understand the operations of power, how we think about social reproduction in relationship to the state are, really being foregrounded by people who are facing these right now. I think the part I was cut up on was there a specific question about political prisoners?
Yeah, they said, how can we continue to not undermine the potential of political prisoners from Mexico to Latin America to the United States and their making of these spaces of creating and spreading knowledge?
Well, one person that I have to give a shout out to is Alana Lario Gomez, who we had this really kind of fortuitous meeting after, both having done the research where Gomez has a chapter about Leavenworth Penitentiary in the 60s. And so he's thinking about Chicano activists and Puerto Rican independistas and the kind of convergences that they produce in the same space later. And I think it's always important to think about the kind of palimpsest of struggle within incarcerated spaces. So, I mean, you look at any memoir like Asada's autobiography, anytime a person is taught, or, even Angela Davis, when they talk about what they were drawing on within the prison library, there's always this kind of record of all these radical texts, that somebody put together in a library in an earlier era. So there's, I think, a really interesting connection. So, when movements today, it's like Donna Merchant, Assad has taught me, when movements for transformative justice in Chicago are thinking about the legacies of these political prisoners, like, it's important to recognize that there's like this, it's like a lightning bolt. There's a live wire between the struggles of the early 20th century and even the late 19th century that connect directly through these political prisoners to struggles today. So I think it's a really beautiful question.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, concretely, there's No Names Book Club, and, All Power Books here in LA is doing some really interesting work of, like, I know George Pinker-Elam, our comrade, was recently asked Verso to, like, donate a bunch of books, and they are donating them to folks in prison. And Asada's memoir, it's a popular one that is always being kind of circulated. So there's definitely like spaces like that if the person asking is interested in getting involved. Maybe we'll take one more question. Last question.
That's fun that way. I don't know if they speak this.
So and this is more like thought experiment.
Mhm.
So I'm interested in the future, in the context of automation and how it's changing sort of workplaces, but at the same time, like, social media also connects us in really interesting ways. And so I'm sort of envisioning, I come from I'm tired of just being anti, and I want to envision what we're working towards. So just your thoughts on like radical organizing moving forward and where it might be headed based on some of the stuff research you've done.
I love that. I'm also interested in the future. I think that's why I think about the past. So I appreciate that question. I don't know if this is the right answer. I mean, there's a number of things that I think are really cool and interesting, but the thing that I feel compelled to say is about time and anxiety and urgency, because I think they're so terrifying right now, and it's, I think, sometimes hard not to get pushed into the kind of an urgency that lends itself to a kind of pragmatism, right? Like, we can't afford to do this reading, we have to do this now, we can't afford to rethink, we can't reinvent it, we can't do this. And so, there's a kind of awkward place where study belongs in struggle, not exclusively in North America, but I think that there's a kind of reticence to, think about its seamlessness with political movements. So the thing that I'm compelled to talk about is Harriet Tubman. I've been interested in how thinkers have been drawn upon her abolitionist vision, but also her sense of time, right? So in order to think about the future, right? I mean, she's she is bringing people out of slavery, right? You know, the dogs are at her back, right? There's urgency in the superlative sense of the word, right? And yet I think, and I don't remember the author's name, but you know, there have been people who have thought about her sense of time, how she had to look at the stars, how she had to think about the earth, how she had to think about seasons, that if she wasn't quiet enough to be able to be in tune with the world, she couldn't get anybody through. And I feel like that's the kind of tension of, you know, imagining the future right now. How do we not just get propelled by the kind of urgency of everything that we're trying to face? And how do we do this work of trying to find ways to care for each other, to hear each other, to move with each other? Because if we just push through and end up reproducing the very social relations that we're trying to fight against, where have we actually moved? So that's kind of what's on my heart right now. How do we balance those, you know, how do we move fast while slowing down?
There was actually a question about that in the chat, so you kind of answered it, but just to bring that out, because this person asked it multiple times, and I think you just answered it. But how can the situation for common people evolve without using the similar tools as the oppressor, or the rhetoric that the oppressor is well versed in?
Yeah, I'll just say that was my answer. But maybe
I just wanted to make sure they addressed it, because there were a lot of questions.
I'll just add this too, because you mentioned automation, and I think like in higher ed, there's a lot of panic, and I mean, in civilization, there's a lot of panic about the automation of thinking and writing and like the chat GPT, right? So, you know, some of our challenge is like not to behave in a way that can be easily automated, right? If we are thinking and writing in a very like programmatic, you know, way, we are lending ourselves to that. That like, you know, I mean, I feel like this is always the kind of challenge, like you're not trying to outthink the computer, but I think that the presence of this new technology also tells us something about what years of austerity and precarity, the restructuring of education, the restructuring of journalism, the restructuring of publishing has kind of forced a lot of our hands, you know, to like just blooded of creativity. So there's a very radical way, you know, in which thinking poetically, thinking in ways that can't be easily reproduced, I think, to answer this question, you know, like I think that's a big challenge before us.
That's being trained to write poetry though.
Yeah. All right, so scratch that.
Well, thank you, Christina, and thanks everyone who stuck around